Hello. In this last lecture concerning Nyaya philosophy, we're going to look at a third argument for the existence of a self, focusing on the notion of self-determination. Recall once again that the overall argument offered by the Nyaya philosophers is that there are certain data, certain phenomena in our experience, such as effort, pleasure, pain, and so on, and these phenomena the Buddhists will recognize, but the Nyaya philosopher argues that those phenomena are possible only if a self exists. The self is needed to explain things like desire. There needs to be something that has desires. In the previous lectures, I explained the arguments that concerned how the self is substantial or a thing rather than a process, and how the self is enduring over time. This lecture focuses on the notion of self-determination. What it means for the self to be self-determining is that it is not always determined by other things. In other words, the self is an independent entity to some extent. Recall that on the Buddhist view, everything depends fully on other things. And so if you depend on other things, you're just pushed around by other things that exist. What explains your behavior is really the result of how other things have affected you. But if you're self-determining or independent, you determine your own behavior. You determine your own personality and character. And so what the Nyaya philosopher wants to argue is that there is a self that's a thing that exists through time, and that this self is independent, has some control over itself. The arguments here are based on the notion of karma. First, Vatsyayana argues as follows, quote, "For those who deny a permanent self, there would be no connection between the agent of sin and its results, the results of sin. In other words, if you deny that there is a self, then there's nothing performing the actions. There's just a bunch of different actions, and there's nobody that performs the actions. So when a lie is told, there's nobody that's performing the lie, there's just merely the act of lying. And so the act of lying cannot be attributed to an agent that performs that act. And this is because on that view, on the view that denies the existence of a permanent self, each being stands distinct from every other. Each action stands distinct from every other. And so what Vatsyayana is doing is pointing out the consequences of holding the Buddhist view, and he's arguing that the consequences are unacceptable. And here's what he says, quote, "There results the unacceptable consequence of losing what one has done and acquiring what one has not done." So what is that unacceptable consequence? Essentially, we cannot hold people responsible for what they do. If an action is performed, such as lying, and there's no one behind that lying, there's no agent that performs that lying, there's no one to hold responsible, no one to punish or chide and tell them that they shouldn't lie. Rather, there's just a bunch of actions, moral, immoral, whatever character they have. They're not performed by any agent. We can't reward people for good actions. We can't punish people for bad actions. And so, since the Buddhist recognizes that karma exists, Vatsyayana is saying that doctrine of karma is not compatible with the Buddhist view of denying the self. Karma is possible only if good actions are rewarded and bad actions are punished. But there needs to be someone that is rewarded and someone that is punished. Now, Vatsyayana focuses on the Buddhist acceptance of karma. Uddatakara will offer an argument that focuses on a different aspect of what the Buddha accepts. Uddatakara argues as follows, quote, "On the Buddhist view, there could be no effort for liberation, since liberation would be achieved without effort. For example, celibate religious life, something that the Buddha recommends for people pursuing the path of Buddhism in order to liberate themselves from the cycle of rebirth, that celibacy would be meaningless. That's what Udatakara says. We don't need to focus so much on his example of celibacy, but rather focus on how he analyzes what the Buddhist monk tries to do. And he basically points out that what the Buddhist monk is trying to do is unintelligible in a certain way. The Buddhist monk wants to liberate themselves from the cycle of rebirth. They want to extinguish themselves so that they don't continue persisting through that cycle. But you're extinguishing yourself or liberating yourself. Notice how I phrase that. Yourself is the thing that is liberated. Yourself is the thing that is extinguished. And so what Udatakara is saying is that in adopting the Buddhist practices, you're adopting them in part on behalf of yourself, to do something for yourself. That's what gives the actions meaning. Otherwise, they're unintelligible. So let us now see how we can reconstruct an argument drawing from both of the two philosophers we have seen. First, if there were no self, then whatever performs an action only exists at a single moment in time, doesn't endure or persist in time. Rather, you just have discrete events from one moment to the next, without those events being unified by some underlying entity. But then it would not be possible to hold anyone responsible for actions. It's not possible to hold somebody responsible for an action, because the being that you hold responsible, the being that you punish for an immoral action, is going to be a distinct entity from the being that performed the original action. So you're doing something unfair. You're punishing one being for the actions of another. So what this means is that we have a new argument for the existence of an enduring self. We saw other arguments in the previous lecture, but this is a new one focused on an analysis of action. But the crucial point for present purposes is number 4. Number 4 includes the insights from both Vatsyayana and Udatakara. Vatsyayana pointed out that it makes sense to hold people responsible only if they can change their own behavior. It makes sense to reward and punish a being only if that being is in some way in control of their own actions. Similarly, it makes sense for you personally to have goals only if you have a self that you can change. And that was Udatakara's point. You have a goal like the Buddhist does of liberating yourself. That goal, like any goal, makes sense only if you think of yourself as the same being over time and as a being that has control over its life, as having control for pursuing and accomplishing the goal that's been specified, whatever it is. And what that means is that the self that we have seen to be substantial and enduring also needs to be able to determine itself. In other words, that it in some way is independent from things external to itself and can determine its own behavior. Now, this argument raises a number of philosophical issues, and we can see them by thinking about how to evaluate this argument. First of all, the Buddhist philosopher once again would appeal to a distinction between self and person, where self is understood to be this permanent, substantial thing that exists independently of other things, can determine itself. But a person is just a mere bundle of psychological states, and those states are constantly in flux and changing. And what the Buddhist philosopher would say using that distinction is that we can hold persons responsible, that we can seek goals for persons. So you view yourself as a bundle of psychological states, and you want to change the future of that bundle of psychological states. Likewise, you view other people as these mere bundles, but these bundles that have causal connections from one moment to the next. So there's no one underlying entity, but rather individual components of those bundles lead to results. So hunger will lead to the act of eating, for example, and then the act of eating will lead to a feeling of pleasure or satisfaction. And so from one moment to the next, there's causal connections, and it's in virtue of those causal connections that we can hold people responsible, and likewise pursue various goals. All of the points we have considered in this lecture raise the question of free will. Whether we have free will and can hold people responsible for their free actions, or whether we're fully determined by things outside of ourselves, or things that are inside of ourselves, like our genetics. The Nyaya view, as we've seen in this lecture, tends to focus more on the libertarian side of the debate of free will. The libertarian side holds that we have liberty, we have genuine freedom to determine ourselves independently of external factors. And as we've seen, Nyaya philosophers hold that we need to accept this sort of libertarian view in order to make sense of our practices, such as holding people responsible and pursuing goals for ourselves. But it's worth noting that many philosophers hold a different view called compatibilism. This view holds that determinism, the view that our actions are externally determined by other factors, is compatible with some notion of freedom. The notion of freedom accepted by a determinist would be weaker than that of the libertarian. The libertarian holds that we're free insofar as we can determine ourselves independently of all other factors, that we have full control, at least in some moments of our lives. The compatibilists, on the other hand, would say, even if we're fully determined from one moment to the next, the types of ways in which we're determined matters. So, for example, if someone puts a gun to your head and says that they'll shoot you unless you tell a lie, well, telling a lie in that situation is coerced. It's determined in a way that reduces your freedom. But if telling a lie results from something internal to yourself, from your own desire and your own knowledge, then telling a lie in that situation is something that you did, and so we can hold you responsible, and so it's free in that more limited sense. And for compatibilists, that action counts as free even if you did not really choose your desires at a deep level, even if your desires were determined by external factors. Nevertheless, the proximate cause for your performance of telling a lie is something internal, and so it counts as free. That's a very rough sketch of some views concerning free will, but I give it in order to show that the debate between the Buddhist philosopher and the Nyaya philosopher also concerns perennial issues like free will that concern us today.